Report for April 6, 2017. Good evening. Republicans today cleared the way for Neil Gorsuch to be the next Supreme Court justice. This is a big deal because they did it by changing the rules of the game. In other words, the Republican philosophy is if you can't get what you want, you just change the rules. And they used what had been called the nuclear option. Why was it called the nuclear option? It was called the nuclear option because it essentially ended the filibuster. The filibuster, the right to actually stop a vote by senators in order to slow things down, in order to express the view that maybe a bare majority of senators were not responding to the will of the majority or of the United States, or expressing the idea that the Senate is a special chamber. It has responsibility for all of us, not just one district or one state or one party. In fact, I remember the days when the Senate was a place where, although there were partisans, obviously, senators were courteous to each other across party lines. They worked together. They cared about the nation. When I was Secretary of Labor, I worked very closely with people like Alan Simpson, Republican from Wyoming, and Nancy Kassenbaum, Republican from Kansas. And I made friends with Republicans. Republicans were respectful of Democrats. Democrats respectful of Republicans. Nobody would think about changing the rules in order to get their partisan way. No, because they respected the institution. They respected the rules. They respected what the institution stood for. They respected history. They cared about the future and the use of that institution in the future. But Mitch McConnell and today's Republicans in the Senate don't give a damn. The long-anticipated rules change means, this nuclear option, means that any nominee to the Supreme Court can now get through with 51 votes. That's all you need. This is going to heighten partisanship even higher than it is now, make the stakes even larger than they are right now, make party loyalty even bigger and more important than it is now, reduce the small shards of cooperation that are still left in the Senate. It's another triumph of partisanship over the national interest. And frankly, I blame Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is the one who would not even submit for hearings, let alone a vote. Barack Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, who was a moderate. Let me make sure you understand what's going on here. Because Barack Obama submitted the name Merrick Garland, knowing he was just halfway. He was about middle range of the Supreme Court justices. But what did Mitch McConnell do? Mitch McConnell said, no, a president in his last year of office has no legitimacy in putting up a Supreme Court nominee, so we're not going to even hold hearings. For 8 months, nothing happened until the end of the Obama administration. And then Donald Trump put up somebody who was not a moderate, not somebody in the middle. He pulled up Neil Gorsuch, who has a record of being all the way to the right, somewhere close to Clarence Thomas, an originalist. That means somebody who thinks the Constitution should be interpreted as the framers of the Constitution viewed it in the 18th century, that it actually is an 18th century document. Forget about the 20th century, forget about the 21st century, forget about any issues that are contemporaneous. Let's just look at the framers' view of the Constitution in the 18th century, before African Americans were full citizens, before women had the right to vote, before anything that we now take for granted in our society in terms of rights and legalism and the rule of law before much of it came to fruition. Mitch McConnell will be remembered as one of the most hypocritical and partisan Senate Majority Leaders in American history, who consistently has put party above country. Shame on him. I want to talk about shame because it seems to me that that is an issue. Shame and honor. A country is understood in some ways by what it feels is shameful, what it views as honorable, how it either deals with shame or honor. Take, for example, Devin Nunes. Devin Nunes, you recall, was the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, charged with looking into whether Donald Trump's associates colluded with Russian operatives in tilting the 2016 election to favor Trump. Nunes resigned that position today. Temporarily, he said he would not be in charge of the Intelligence Committee with regard to those hearings. Now, viewed one way, that could be a very honorable move. But Nunes explained his decision to step aside by blaming what he called false complaints from left-wing activist groups. Now, let me assure you that in the House today, run by the Republicans, claims from Democrats or left-wing activist groups fall on deaf ears. There is no reason to suppose that it was the claims of left-wing activist groups that did Nunes in. No, Nunes did himself in. Nunes did himself in because he was shown to be a stooge of Trump and public opinion. And here's where honor and shame came in. He was shamed to the point where it was very clear to him and the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee, as well as to Democrats, that there was no way that committee would have any legitimacy in moving forward as long as Nunes was in charge of that committee and that investigation. So shame did play a role here, but it wasn't left-wing activists that did it. Devin Nunes, you know that as well as I do. Public opinion. It was public opinion about the illegitimacy of you running that investigation. And by the way, speaking of shame, Donald Trump told reporters today that he's had, quote, one of the most successful 13 weeks in the history of the presidency, unquote. One of the most successful 13 weeks in the history of the presidency. Now, Trump is known to exaggerate a bit, a lot, wildly, beyond belief. But to characterize his presidency so far as successful is, well, his entire legislative agenda has been stalled. His promise to repeal Obamacare never happened. His Muslim ban is upheld in the courts and is not moving forward. His possible collusion with Russia over the 2016 election is preoccupying Congress and the White House. He had to fire his national security advisor. His attorney general had to recuse himself from overseeing the FBI as part of the investigation. The White House itself is in utter chaos. It's not clear who's running anything there. And Trump's non-stop lies have brought his office into disrepute and his favorability ratings down to the lowest of any president in history at this point in office. And he says he's had one of the most successful 13 weeks in the history of the presidency. Oh, by the way, it's not been 13 weeks. It's been 11 weeks. He even lied about that. Seems like 11 years, 11 months. It's been 11 weeks. And Donald Trump, and the shame of Donald Trump, extends out in all sorts of directions. For example, the Board of Education of Newtown, Connecticut, a while back, sent a letter to Trump asking that he acknowledge that 20 children and 6 adults were murdered there on December 14th, 2012, at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, and that Donald Trump condemn those who repeatedly have said that that was a hoax, that it never occurred, and that he remove his support from anyone who falsely claims that the tragedy was staged. Now, that letter from the Board of Education of Newtown, Connecticut, comes in response to fake news spread by Trump supporter Alex Jones of InfoWars, who as recently as March 8th, as recently as this past March 8th, continued to question whether the Sandy Hook killings actually happened. Trump appeared on Jones' show during the campaign, afterwards called to thank him for his support. That town that went through that unspeakable tragedy, because of Alex Jones and the conspiracy theorists that Donald Trump has spawned, continues to be bedeviled by visitors convinced that the murder and murders were a meticulously staged government hoax carried out to justify new gun control laws. Harassing, hurtful, even threatening emails, phone calls, internet postings continue to plague many of the victims' families and town officials. So the board made a straightforward request to Donald Trump, just out of compassion. They have not heard back. Nada. Nothing. Talk about shame. And finally tonight, let me say something about Trump's Department of Homeland Security, which is very busy these days, rounding up undocumented immigrants here in the United States, including young people, dreamers who have been here since they were infants, including many law-abiding, productive members of our communities. Trump's Department of Homeland Security wants Twitter to reveal the name of an anonymous tweeter. Officials from the department delivered a summons to Twitter, demanding that the company provide records that would, quote, unmask or likely lead to the unmasking of the person or people behind a certain account. Now, you might ask yourself, what's the allegation here? What did this person do that was so bad that Twitter, that is the Department of Homeland Security, has to demand from Twitter the name of this person? What is the offense? Well, the anonymous tweets don't threaten Homeland Security. They have absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. They don't reveal government secrets. They don't defame or embarrass or endanger anyone. So what is the rationale behind the Department of Homeland Security's demand? The supposed offense is that the tweets are critical of the Trump administration. Now, those tweets come from an account that is still active indicating that it's run by someone who claims to be a government employee working at the Immigration Service inside the Department of Homeland Security. But the description on that account stresses that its views are not the views of the Department of Homeland Security. Twitter, talk about honor, kudos to Twitter. It filed a lawsuit today against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, asking the court to prevent the department from taking steps to unmask the name of this user under the First Amendment, the protection accorded the First Amendment, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech. If somebody wants to criticize the Trump administration, they should be able to do it anonymously without fear of intimidation or retribution. Now, this account in question is one of many so-called alternative government accounts that have been popping up all over since Trump's election, including accounts apparently run by employees or former employees of the National Park Service, National Weather Service, the Labor Department, my old department, bless them. All of these accounts questioning Trump administration policies and also doing something else that is enormously valuable for the public, and that is fact-checking, letting the public know what the truth is, giving the public access to data that rebuts what the Trump administration has asserted. It's not just the First Amendment rights of these individuals that is at stake here. It is also the public's right to know. Accountability, it's called. So kudos to Twitter for pushing back on this. Shame on the Department of Homeland Security and the Trump administration for its attempt to block free speech. Your questions. Joanna Law Stewart, how many times has the Senate changed the rules like they did today regarding Supreme Court nominees? Since when is it okay to change the rules just because you don't like the outcome? Isn't one of the reasons our government was structured that way so that we have to find a way to compromise? Joanna, you're absolutely right. In fact, it is very rare that the Senate changes its rules, and it's rare for the simple reason that if you're bound by certain rules of procedure, then you have to work within those rules of procedure, and for exactly the reason you mentioned, find compromise. And what the Senate did today, Mitch McConnell did, and Republicans, is essentially say, forget compromise. Compromise is out the window. We don't have to take your views, you Democrats, into account. And I don't have to remind you, I don't think, that we're not talking about just a random judge or a bill. We're talking about a Supreme Court justice who could be there for 10 or 20 or 30 years interpreting the Constitution of the United States, interpreting statutes, laws. Enormous power. Emily Sawyer, please explain the impact of a Gorsuch confirmation on cases that are currently pending in the Supreme Court. That's your first question, Emily. Well, questions that are already argued before the Supreme Court will not be heard by Gorsuch because they've already been argued. But cases that are pending that have not been argued, where the evidence is simply, and the briefs are just coming in, Gorsuch will probably be part of that. The second part of your question, Emily, is also when the nuclear option is invoked, does that mean all future nominees will be confirmed this way, or does it have to be invoked case by case? No, it's all future nominees. It means, Emily, that if, for example, and I certainly hope this doesn't happen, but if another Justice of the Supreme Court were to die under a Trump administration, that next nominee would be going through with only 51 votes and no opportunity to filibuster. Ken Rawls, if either party gains a supermajority in the Senate in the future, would it make sense for them to reverse the rule change McConnell pushed through today? Ken, any party could reverse that rule change. Rule changes can be made on the basis of 51 votes. You don't need a supermajority to reverse a rule change. That is, if the Senate were to be controlled by 51 Democrats starting in 2018, they could push the rule back to what it was before. Now, would they? Will they? It would not be in their short-term interest, because obviously if they have 51 votes, they might want to keep the rule as it is right now and let Mitch McConnell stew. But maybe if there are still statesmen left, they might say, no, we need on Supreme Court nominees especially to require a supermajority, to require that 60 senators agree, because that will slow us down, force us to compromise, make us think harder, because this is such an important confirmation. Patricia Armstrong Hill, after almost a year of obstruction by the Republicans, why didn't the Democrats use the nuclear option to ensure Merrick Garland's appointment to the Supreme Court? Well, Patricia, the Democrats did not have the majority. When Merrick Garland was nominated by Barack Obama, the Republicans were in control of the Senate. In fact, the Republicans have been in control of the Senate since 2011. It was in the election of 2010 that they gained a majority in the Senate. And since then, it's been nothing but obstruction. Even worse in the House. Kathleen Moran, do you think the replacement of Devin Nunes will make any difference in the Russian investigation, or is it the same old game under 3 new Devin Nunes lookalikes? Kathleen, I'll tell you what encourages me. And I know that I spend a lot of time in these resistance reports telling you things that may enrage and upset you, but here's one encouraging thing. Public opinion really does count. That is, the Republicans in the House now in charge of that investigation in the House Intelligence Committee, just like the Republicans on the Senate Intelligence Committee, they want to run an investigation that is respectable. They want to have the public behind them. They don't want it to look partisan. This is in their interests as well as the public's interests. And this is where I get a little bit encouraged, because it is a matter of honor. It's a matter of doing your job well. It's a matter of doing the public interest. Celia Bell, what are the chances that Trump will be impeached before November of 2020? In other words, is he going to be impeached in his first term, or maybe only term? Celia, I think the chances grow greater every day, because the circumstantial evidence of the Russian connection grow almost daily. It's a steady drip, drip, drip. What the Trump White House apparently has not learned, and Trump certainly did not learn, is what happened to Richard Nixon. When there is a cover-up, it gets worse and worse, because the press and the public become more and more interested in what is being covered up. The question shifts from the cover-up to why is it being covered up, and then it shifts to what did the president know and when did he know it. That's what happened to Richard Nixon. Now with Nixon, it was a third-rate burglary into Watergate, into the Watergate complex. Here, we're not talking about a third-rate anything. This is a matter of our democracy. This is the sanctity and integrity of our democratic process in terms of the 2016 election. It is far more serious than Watergate. And as the evidence rolls in, there is more and more likelihood, it seems to me, that the public will demand an impeachment investigation, and that's what impeachment is. It's an investigation by the House, and then if the House comes up with a vote that this person ought to be impeached, and then the impeachment goes for conviction to the Senate. And I am of the view, more likely than not, actually, right now, the way things are going, that Donald Trump will be impeached. Richard Jackson, a general question about wealth inequality. What might a policy addressing wealth inequality look like? Would it simply be a larger tax on the wealthy and smaller taxes on the poor and middle class, or a different kind of policy altogether? Richard Jackson, you're talking about not income inequality, you're talking about wealth inequality. Wealth inequality in the United States today is even larger than income inequality. Income inequality is as large as it's been since the 1920s. Wealth inequality is larger than it has been since the 1890s, because wealth is the cumulative effect of income. What can we do about wealth inequality? Well, you mentioned one thing we could do, and that is have a tax on wealth. Thomas Piketty, in his book Capitalism, suggested exactly that, a tax on wealth. We do have a wealth tax in the form of a property tax at the local level. No reason we could not have a wealth tax nationally. But what we could also do is make it easier for people to save and invest. Maybe make it easier for people to accumulate wealth. Right now, it's very, very difficult. The tax code is prejudiced against people who don't have very much money and gives huge tax benefits to people who do have money and can save. We should reverse that. Two more questions. SandraFarber, wouldn't reversing Citizens United take much of the money out of politics? How can we make this happen? Sandra, reversing Citizens United is definitely an important step to take. It would not take money necessarily out of politics, because even before Citizens United, there was a lot of money in American politics, far more than in any other advanced democracy, far more than we should have in our system. What we need, in addition to reversing Citizens United, is we need full disclosure of where every dollar comes from that affects any campaign. We need to slow down, if not stop, the revolving door between government and businesses and Wall Street. We also need to provide public financing for all elections. And this is the last one. Lisa Marie, what can people living in blue states do to help the resistance? I sign petitions, yet feel so hopeless. Lisa Marie, one thing you can do is you can go to your computer and you can take a look at this website, swingleft.org. This website will put you in contact with the nearest red district or purple district to you. And this website, sisterdistrict.com, is building itself up. It's going to be ready soon, and it will enable you to actually make a sister district, your blue district with a purple or red district, or the people in those districts, so you can help in a variety of ways. I also want to remind you about indivisibleguide.com. And I want to remind you about this because this gives you a lot of information about what you need to do to influence your members of Congress, to join an indivisible group near you. There are now over 6,000 of them around the country, at least 2 in every congressional district. And it will also enable you next week, during congressional recess, to confront your members of Congress. And what I've been trying to do on this webpage is give you some tips as well in how you can confront your members of Congress, because some of them, frankly, don't want to deal with you. They don't want to be confronted. Well, I suppose I don't blame them, but they should be. They are accountable to you. They're accountable to the people. They are public servants. They are not members of an aristocracy. They are there because they're supposed to be doing your work. That ends tonight's Resistance Report. I'll see you tomorrow.